A green hill covered with wavering grass sweeps up to a mighty castle bright in the light of summer morning. At the highest parapet of this castle you stand. Light breeze ruffles your hair. You look out and you see ring after concentric ring encircling your castle, stretching to the near horizon. Active in the space between each ring, you see everyone you've ever known and loved. This castle is your soul at the beginning of the Jeffersonian era in 1787. Those concentric ramparts encircling your castle are the hierarchy of intermediating institutions that form Jeffersonian society. They provide not only a defense, but also, equally important, the definition of your identity. Visualize each ring from farthest to nearest. In the distance is the ring wall of the local state. This is not the federal state with its 50 administrative units. It is the local, near, and familiar state. General Lee wrote to Winfield Scott in his resignation from the Union Army, quote, "Save in the defense of my native state, I never desire again to draw my sword." This was a meaning of patriotism, North and South, in this era. Remember that at this time, over 90% of the population was involved in agriculture, which had a profound local attachment. This attachment lasted longer in the South and possessed there an almost mystical quality, as the neglected Southern novelist Farrell Sams describes on the first page of his Run with the Horsemen. In the beginning was the land. Shortly thereafter was the father. The boy, the main character, knew this with certainty. It was a knowledge that was in his marrow. It predated memory and conscious thought as surely as hunger and thirst. He could not have explained it, but he knew it. He also knew that in turn the land owned his father. Everything the father did eventually revolved around nurture of the land. Without the land, there would be no family. The next proximate wall is the institution of property. Property is the indispensable foundation of every right. It is the instrument for exercising any right. Well, you may ask, does this mean that George Soros has more rights than I do? Certainly, his right of free speech is magnified by his millions spent to elect progressive district attorneys. But does he have 9 lives or more like a cat? He has 1 life, as each of us does. It is impossible to attack that greater property enjoyed by the rich without also undermining that fundamental property of each person in his own life. This unique property of each person provides the only meaning of the term equality, equal protection of that single original property before the law. The next concentric ring surrounding your castle is associations of countless types, which were famously described by de Tocqueville. I read from chapter 5 of his Democracy in America. He's writing in 1831 at the very flourishing of the Jeffersonian era. Quote, "The Americans make associations to give entertainments, to found seminaries, to build inns, to construct churches, to diffuse books, to send missionaries to the Antipodes. In this manner, they found hospitals, prisons, and schools. Wherever at the head of some new undertaking you see the government in France or a man of rank in England, in the United States, you will be sure to find an association." The next ring is a specifically vocational association, not just trade associations and business clubs, but especially apprenticeships. This is the main way that young men acquired their life's work then. Although legal and medical schools existed at the time, typically a young lawyer learned by reading law, meaning apprenticeship in an existing law office. The next ring is the church, the heart of the community, mutual assistance, and social life. The first permanent structure erected by American settlers moving west typically was a church. The next ring is the institution of traditional marriage, which was a special defense for the economically disadvantaged wife and dependent children. Next is the family. Men die, but through their children, their spiritual worth is projected into the future. In the West, the status of the wife rose from chattel to reverence, as witnessed the adoration of Mary, Holy Mother of God, beginning in the 11th century. And finally, at the last and closest ring of defense and identity is one's own sexual identity, which was learned then primarily from close and persistent contact with family members, especially those of the same gender. The state is at war with every one of these intermediating institutions. Let us examine its assault on each ring in turn. Patriotism is no longer rooted in the red clay and pine straw of Georgia, in the smell of the sea in the low country, in the black clay of central Texas. Patriotism now means the ideology of the federal state indoctrinated as a universal truth in its public schools. Property is no longer the basis of all rights and the principle of equality before the law, thanks to the state intellectuals' false distinction between unlimited personal rights and a limited right to possessions. The federal state now has the power to take any amount of property for public use. This power was first established in the Supreme Court ruling Munn, M-U-N-N, versus Illinois in 1877, and then again in 2012 with the ruling NFIB versus Sibelius. World Economic Forum President Klaus Schwab has said, quote, by 2030, you will own nothing and be happy. And he might have added, and all your rights will be protected. Associations are now regulated by the federal state. Private clubs and associations may discriminate only if they can demonstrate being a, quote, bona fide membership club, end quote, with no principled protections against a determined and well-funded litigant. Vocational associations are now regulated by the federal state. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 destroyed the meaning of property-based individual rights by creating group rights. Its Title VII Amendment prohibits employers from discriminating based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. But the courts further extended it to discrimination based on, quote, stereotypes or, quote, disparate treatment, terms to be determined by the whim of a federal judge. Churches are now regulated by the federal state, as our initial speaker demonstrated this morning. Churches can, at a whim, be judged a threat to the state, as when the FBI recently placed traditional Catholics under surveillance as, quote, potential terrorists in Richmond, Virginia. Marriage is now regulated by the federal state. In the span of a single administration, that of Barack Obama, the Defense of Marriage Act was memory hold in favor of same-sex unions for sodomites. This abomination was codified in Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015 by reference to the 14th Amendment. The federal state's power now supersedes that of the family. The state now exercises power to destroy, for example, black families by misguided welfare assistance, and to forcibly take children from parents who deny them, quote, gender-affirming care. The federal state now assumes the power to define sexual identity. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, in further destruction of the meaning of individual rights based in property, was extended by the 1972 Title IX Amendment to prohibit sex discrimination in education programs that receive federal funding, which is almost all of them. This has now been reinterpreted to prevent discrimination based on, quote, gender identity and, quote, gender expression, regardless of age. The anxiety of puberty is made more traumatic by the enforced association with other children in public school. Children now spend more time with other bewildered, impressionable children than with character-shaping adults, and must now be exposed to a transgender day of visibility. Professor Alan Walker of Old Dominion University, sad to say, a branch of the College of William and Mary, which educated Jefferson and Monroe, redefined pederasts as blameless, minority-attracted persons. When his contract ended in 2022, he wasn't fired. Over 50 professors signed a letter in his support. Other state-sponsored professors teach that men can become pregnant. Now you know exactly why the federal state hates the South. The South proclaims this hierarchy of intermediating institutions as its historical Jeffersonian essence. Remember this image that I painted for you with the castle and so on as the A from which my B, C, and D will be derived in a moment. I have rather dramatically placed a head of thanks that I now deliver to our Southern Brain Trust, the Abbeville Institute. Here a listener may ask, now wait. A government at war with every intermediating institution can only be socialist or tending to absolutism. Have you correctly defined government, Mr. Hulsey? No, I have defined the state. The state is not government. It's a form of government only 377 years old. Stop counting. The state form of government must be socialist because of its hostility to property. It must tend to absolutism in order to possess the power of destroying these intermediating institutions. Considering the destructive nature of the state form of government, the question really is, why did it come into existence at all? Especially when there were available at the time far more successful, far longer-lived models. For example, the Hanseatic League. It lasted over half a millennium, starting in the year 1159. For example, the Swiss Federation. It has lasted 734 years, from 1291 to the present. For example, the Venetian Republic. It lasted exactly 1,100 years, starting in the year 697. The state form of government was created on October 24th, 1648, with the Treaty of Westphalia as a result of a historical crisis. In the 16th century, a plague swept across all of Europe. Not the 14th century Black Plague, not a physical disease, but a plague that exposed an existential threat to the entire Western world. It was a mass psychogenic illness that I'll describe in a moment. Once it was inoculated, it became Protestantism. The last 4 years should give ample evidence that this threat is always with us. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses on the door of All Saints Church in Wittenberg on Halloween Day in 1517, he ripped the scab off a number of religious enthusiasms from which the church had previously healed itself. Millennialist or millenarian or chiliastic sects had been in Europe long before, but the church had suppressed most by the early 15th century. The Albigensians, also called Cathars, were suppressed by a crusade in 1229, as also were the radical Taborites in 1434. The Brethren of the Free Spirit, whose motto was, quote, "Whatever the eye sees and covets, let the hand grasp it," were also suppressed before Luther's time. However, in 1520, just 3 years after Luther's famous posting, a German priest named Thomas Munzer took to heart Luther's suggestion that anyone could read the Bible unambiguously. Munzer's reading led him to a theocratic Anabaptism, Anabaptism being the belief that election, or the sign of admittance to eternal life, was an emotional, mystical conversion experience, a process of being born again or baptized in the Holy Spirit. In the city of Mulhausen, Munzer proclaimed himself the living Christ, abolished marriage, and proclaimed omnia sunt communia, all things are to be held in common, and murdered the non-elect as he judged them. When attacked by an army of princes on May 15, 1524, he told his peasant followers not to worry, that he would catch all the enemy cannonballs in the sleeves of his cloak. In the ensuing battle, all of his 5,000 followers were put to death as he was after being tortured. There are numerous examples of this religious hysteria, but here's one more. In 1532, Anabaptists flooded into the city of Munster, declaring a New Jerusalem where no work was required, thanks to property stolen from the original townfolk. Several Dutchmen took control of the town. One of them, Jan Bokkelsen, became a communist dictator, abolishing all private property and private ownership of money. After running naked through the town like an Adamite and falling into a 3-day trance, he revived and had himself declared king of the whole world with antinomian purity. Antinomianism proclaims that one's soul is so purely liberated from the flesh that one can gluttonize, fornicate, and murder without sin. However, the usual stern consequences prevail for those who are not the elect. Although the Anabaptists may have enjoyed Bockelsen's edict of enforced promiscuity, or at least half of them, they began to starve after the city was blockaded. Bockelsen said that he would change the cobblestones into loaves of bread. That failing, doubtless from weakness of faith, in 1536, he was captured and tortured to death. Then came the Calvinists at the end of the 1500s. Beginning in 1618, the 30 Years' War broke out, a religious war among Catholics, Lutherans, Calvinists, and Protestants of various sects that was estimated to have killed between a third and half the people living along the Rhine River. There were atrocities on all sides and famine, with some reduced to eating grass and corpses. Everyone realized that the mass psychosis had to be healed again with a wall of separation between religious claims and those of the government. So, on October 24th, 1648, with the Treaty of Westphalia, 30 Years' War was brought to an end by a truly astonishing group of people. It was a gathering of Europe's proto-intellectuals. Real intellectuals didn't appear until the French Revolution, who had no connection with either kings or churchmen, although, of course, they were educated by the church. They bridled the chiliastic and wildly vociferous Protestant impulse by the only means available to them. It could not be by the church that would have been throwing oil on the fire. It had to be by a hypertrophy of the state, by an exaggeration of its sovereign power. Listen to some of the key architects of power at that time. Jean Bodin, died 1596, described sovereignty as, quote, the absolute and perpetual power of a republic, which is subject to no earthly tribunal, a power, notice, which creates law, but is not subjected to the law it creates. As well, this power is indivisible and so cannot be divided between supreme and lesser magistrates. Sovereignty is centralized supreme power, end quote. Hugo Grotius, died 1645, proclaimed the king's sovereignty to be absolute with no basis in sovereignty of the people. Quote, in the case of civil government, one must stop at the supreme person or assembly because higher authority cannot keep ascending to infinity. Only God is devoting to passing judgment on the crimes of this body. Whether a sovereign act is morally acceptable or unacceptable is not a suitable distinguishing criterion for legitimacy, end quote. Thomas Hobbes, you're familiar with, died 1679, proclaimed a leviathan of either king or parliament to be a, quote, mortal god. With the creation of the state form of government, its absolute sovereignty was won. The medieval battles between church and king were over. The church that had sent King Henry IV, barefoot in snow, to Canossa, now entered into a partnership with the state, as did the Protestant churches. Religion and heredity would jointly provide the state that element without which sovereignty was powerless, legitimacy. Then, with a desacralization of religion and heredity, especially after the French Revolution, the state was left hanging in midair without a legitimate foundation. So the defenders of the state made a dramatic switch. It would become solely legitimized by reference to democracy. Notice, democracy is a double-edged sword of legitimacy. This foundation creates a neurotic fear that some element within the democratic process will overthrow the state. The state must perversely proclaim the very principle that contains the seed of its own destruction. The only sure way to remove this threat from some democratic element is to use the democratic idiom to bind the individual directly to its power without intermediaries. For a state founded solely on democratic claims, even one intermediating institution, even one that's so small as one Catholic church in Richmond, Virginia, constitutes a threat to its power. And also, too, in the event of January 6, 2021, There was heavy prosecution of everyone there. 39% of the entire FBI workforce was enlisted to prosecute those people. An event where not a single gun was brandished or discharged by one of these so-called insurrectionists. Ask in the Q&A, possibly tomorrow, why the second coming of the Donald will not fix matters. So for the philosophers of classical liberalism, the paramount question became how to limit the totalitarian impulse of sovereignty in this newly created form of government. Madison's ingenious attempt was federalism. First, we must have a rectification of terms. Professor McClellan has created an excellent video, the 1607 Project, highly recommended to any scholar. One of the contributors there, Barry Shane of Colgate University, points out that in 1787, the true Federalists were really the Anti-Federalists, and those calling themselves Federalists, like the authors of the Federalist Papers, were actually nationalists. Possibly got this from Emmy Bradford's A Better Guide Than Reason. In any case, since Professor Shane is right, the question arises, were the Federalist Papers a Machiavellian document? That's a theme for one of your doctoral students. It seems so for Alexander Hamilton. In Federalist 15, Hamilton described federalism as, quote, the political monster of an imperium in imperio, meaning that divided sovereignty is impossible. Madison, we may assume to be more sincere, his brilliant discovery of federalism to limit state powers, compressed in Federalist 51. Notice the nice mnemonic, 51 for Madison, 15 for Hamilton. Within that essay, he wrote, quote, in the extended Republic of the United States and among a great variety of its interests, parties, and sects, which it embraces, a coalition of a majority of the whole society could seldom take place on any other principles than those of justice and the general good, end quote. Madison is saying that numerous and dispersed factions never combine except for good purposes, which is absurd. This notion was refuted in any case by history even before 1860, for example, by the Northern Imposed Tariff of Abominations of 1828, and in the formation of the Republican Party in 1854, the nation's first sectional political party. John C. Calhoun's attempt to limit the totalitarian impulse of sovereignty was his idea of the concurrent majority. This I will skip because I hope you will bring up in the Q&A exactly the mechanics of how that works. It's not spelled out in the Disquisition on Government. It's not spelled out in the 1798 Kentucky resolutions, but I have a way to explain how it might work. The Enlightenment attempted to rescue the state as enforcer of classical liberalism. It did so by trying to provide a rational foundation to legitimize its claims, but all of its political philosophers foundered on probably what is the greatest distinction in all of modern philosophy. I wish Professor Livingston were here to hear this, but that is David Hume's demonstration that no ought can be derived from an is. That is, philosophers can erect a perfect government according to sweet reason, but they cannot provide for its moral necessity. They cannot provide any moral principle for its legitimacy. The moral foundation of any society is ultimately subjective. Furthermore, sovereignty is up against a second problem, just as insurmountable as Hume's. In 1979, Alfred G. Kuzan, now at University of West Florida, published an essay provocatively entitled, "Do We Ever Really Get Out of Anarchy?" His answer was no. For him, the question was not whether there is anarchy, but who is to enjoy it. There really should be no astonishment in this, since his point simply restates the dilemma framed 3 centuries earlier by the 17th century absolutist. The dilemma is this: there must be some final arbiter of disputes in any society, and it must be perforce anarchic by virtue of standing above the disputes it arbitrates. The only question is the administrative extent of that arbiter. Either there will exist a single centralized arbiter from whose monopoly on police power there is no escape, or there will exist many dispersed arbiters limited by the threat of abandonment. So then, how do we provide a constitution of limited government based on Southern principles? First, we must recognize that the traditional Southern reverence for the near and the familiar does have a principled defense. The foundation for this general preference for the near and familiar must begin with Johannes Althusius, died 1638, specifically with his principle of subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is the insistence that, as far as practical, the most local, the smallest unit perform any government task. This rule demands a corollary. To prevent these smaller units from being overruled by the larger, the smaller must have the power of secession. Without this corollary, there's no hindrance to the larger units overruling the smaller. Secession is the absolutely necessary political tool that enables subsidiarity. So, once we accept the principle of secession as logic demands, we must confront the most salient objection to it. Where does it stop? What is the smallest unit that can claim the right of secession? In the Second American Revolution that ended on April 9, 1865, it was fought between two nations, North and South. Colin Woodard, Richard Kreitner, and George F. Kennan, the famous diplomat, proposed about a dozen nations. Jefferson's ward republics suggest thousands, and Ludwig von Mises an unlimited number, saying, quote, if it were in any way possible to grant this right of self-determination to every individual person, it would have to be done. We reject the argument of von Mises. Secession or self-determination seeks not smallness for its own sake, but to achieve autonomy. A man proclaiming himself to be a society cannot achieve autonomy. He simply casts himself out of the social network that everyone requires for life. And yet the state has mythologized just such a hyperbolically isolated individual by pretending that its power rescues him from the mutual hostility of, quote, man in a state of nature. Every defense of the state form of government, from Jean Bodin to John Rawls to Robert Nozick, begins with some form of the state of nature argument. Calhoun has demolished the myth of man in a state of nature in his disquisition on government. Quote, instead of being the natural state of man, the state of nature is the most opposed to his nature, most repugnant to his feelings, and most incompatible with his wants. His natural state is the social and political, the one for which his creator made him. The hyperbolic individual in a state of nature is the creation myth of the state, his pretended savior, and the darling of critical theory, which claims that every intermediating institution is a historic agent of oppression of the individual. The source of critical theory, the Frankfurt School, has been discussed elsewhere by one of our conference speakers, Wanjiru Njoya. For these theorists of cultural Marxism, and they call themselves that, cultural Marxists, every intermediating institution is not a bastion of defense, not a shaper of identity, but an iron ring, a shackle, a manacle, enslaving this boundless, amorphous, unshaped, hyperbolic individual of unlimited will. As we approach the lunch hour, at least one of us, some of us may embrace one champion of systemic oppression. I refer to San Francisco's fat positivity expert. That's her name. Her name is Virgie Tovar, a 250-pounder, who explains that, quote, this is a quote, eating less cake is oppression.
Amen.
Yeah. We laugh, but these theorists, whittle me off another slice. We laugh, but for these theorists, any limitation on the unlimited will of the hyperbolic individual, whether it be the limitation of social structure or the limitation of his very sex, is not just oppression, but evil. And this hatred for those limitations imposed by the world, by the flesh, is the very definition of Gnosticism. The hyperbolic individual in a supposed state of nature is Gnostic man, who strives for a solipsistic fulfillment deriving solely from his will. Every government, every one, models a standard of excellence from its ideal type. Achilles for the Greeks, Aeneas for the Romans, the Christian gentleman for the South. As for the state, it has idealized Gnostic man, and in this role, it is its natural aspect of its hostility to democratic intermediating institutions has made it an engine of total absolutism. So then, how to achieve defense, identity, and autonomy? Through the principle already familiar to you, through that hierarchy of intermediating institutions that we dramatized at the outset. This hierarchy of symbiotic rights, as Althusius called them, is precisely Jeffersonian society. And the smallest administrative unit that best realizes this hierarchy is the county. This unit best fits the ideal size for a democratic community as determined by the research of Professor Livingston on the Swiss cantons, a community of no more than 250,000 people or so. The county is the smallest unit of government that resolves our previously stated dilemma that there must be one anarchic final arbiter of disputes in any society. The final arbiter of disputes in a Jeffersonian society is those many dispersed counties. Their functioning is described in my book, which you can have for free by application at this email address. Now, a society whose counties embody the Jeffersonian hierarchy is immensely more free than the state form of government. But this freedom is not secure until one more thing is achieved: the annihilation of elective majoritarian politics. Imagine that blessed dawn when there are no more ranting, lying politicians, no more media poseurs, no more of their squealing that the productive pay their fair share as determined by some envious bureaucrat who never met a payroll, who never erected anything. Majoritarian politics can only be destroyed by the institution of non-stratified sortition. Sortition is simply the election of public officers by random lot. Stratification is the tweaking of the initial random pool to achieve the fiction of demographic representation by creating quotas arbitrarily chosen for gender, race, age, wealth, etc. Sortition is no novelty. It's been in use since the 5th century before Christ in Athens down to the present day. However, the recent application of sortition has completely perverted it by its use of demographic stratification. A tool that was once democratic is now its very opposite. Many national sortitions have been conducted in the last 15 years in Iceland, Finland, Ireland, Britain, and France. They have decided divisive issues such as abortion, same-sex marriage, and climate change, all with prejudice to favor the state position. Sortition succeeds with 3 corrections that restore its democratic essence. By discarding the shibboleth of demographic representation, by demanding private instead of public deliberation, and by forming the necessarily subjective initial pool at the beginning so that any person chosen from that pool is competent according to each county's arbitrarily chosen standard of excellence. So we've covered a great deal of ground, possibly a semester of political science. You can now take the test in the McClanahan Academy. Another great offering recommended to any scholar here. So we start out by saying that the essence of Jeffersonian society consisted in this hierarchy of intermediating institutions. We saw that it was underthread at every level by the federal government, raising the question, why would a government be opposed to such civilizing influences? And we postponed the answer to the question of why by first answering the how. It got there by addressing a crisis in the 17th century resolved by the creation of the state in 1648. So that presented the dilemma of sovereign anarchy. We saw that there must be one final arbiter of disputes. The left horn of the dilemma, and I use left and right advisedly here, is resolved by there being a central state with sovereign anarchic power with a monopoly on the police. The right horn of the dilemma was resolved in one example by federalism offered by Madison. That lasted 73 years. Our Confederate boys died for federalism. Another option was offered by the concurrent majority, which, however, was never instituted. I am offering here that the sovereign anarchy be resolved in the counties being the perfect size for a democratic government. Whatever these options, whichever one might have been adopted, there was still one more thing needed, and that was the abolition of elective majoritarianism, accomplished by the specially mentioned form of secession. So to conclude, I call a society that combines the hierarchy of Jeffersonian intermediating institutions with non-stratified sortition as Claristocracy. Kleros being the Greek word for random lot. You can easily say aristocracy. Just say cla instead of a. Claristocracy. Claristocracy. Nothing complicated about it. I welcome any challenge in fact or logic to my alternative to the failed state form of government. I do not expect it from the Academy. It has been captured by the state and now serves as a moribund sinecure for time servers who cannot think outside its form. You like that? They are unable to demand that the state be defined as a form of government, so none of them can identify its ills, so none of them can possibly offer an escape from those ills. Only Claristocracy provides a constitution for the future rooted in Southern Jeffersonian principles. Thank you.